Hello, everybody, and welcome to our very first session of Crime Writers Week. It is so great to see all of you here. I've been just checking out the chat as we've been waiting for folks to join. We have people from all over. It seems from basically every single time zone. We have people from Canada, some from London, Connecticut, Arizona, a few of you who are in Pacific time, just like our speakers, Rachelle and Anne, for whom it is the crack of dawn. So for those of you for whom it's early in the morning, I hope you are enjoying your cups of coffee. Yes, I am Linda. I am no longer in New York. This is me coming to you live from my apartment in Scotland, my very first event here in Scotland. And we are about to get started very shortly with our first session for Crime Writers Week. But before we begin, I just want to make sure that everything is working properly. So if you can see and hear me, we've already have people telling us where they're from. Why don't you tell me if this is your first time at Crime Writers Week, or if you were at previous Crime Writers Weeks, or if you were at Fantasy or Romance Week. Okay, we've got a couple first timers. Oh, lots of first timers here. Oh my gosh, wonderful. Second Crime Writers Week. Some has done them all. That's amazing. Last year, first time. Oh my gosh. Okay. A big mix of folks for whom this is the first time, or people who've come to Romance Week and now are just coming to crime. This is great. Amazing. Okay, well, it is so great to see so many of you folks here. And just like I said, before we get started, I just want to do a couple quick housekeeping notes. So as you can tell, the chat moves extremely quickly. So if you have questions for our presenters today, and I can almost guarantee that you will, please use the Q&A box instead of the chat. The chat just moves far too quickly for us to keep up to. So the Q&A box will let us keep track of those questions. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll be able to ask those of Anne and Rachelle. So please use the Q&A box if you have questions. Now, we will try to get through as many questions live as we possibly can today, but we will probably have more questions than we have time for. So Rachelle has very generously offered to come into the ProWritingAid Partners in Crime Facebook group to answer any questions that we don't get through live. So if you miss any questions or you don't have an opportunity to ask your question or get your question answered, feel free to join us on the group later. I'm putting a bunch of links in the chat, and the last one is the Crime Writers Week Hub. There is a link on the hub to the Facebook group so that you can join there and ask Rachelle any questions that you have later. Okay, so covered the Q&A. Please use that. And again, we'll try to get through as many questions as we possibly can. On that note as well, Anne and Rachelle will also send me their slides after this presentation so that I can share them on the Crime Writers Week Hub after we're done. So don't worry, there's going to be a lot of information during this session, but we will have the slides and you will be able to ask them questions both during the session and then after. And then finally, if you're using the chat to connect with other participants today, which we definitely encourage, please make sure you select everyone from the drop-down menu near the chat box. That makes sure that everyone can see your messages and not just me. So Q&A box. We will have the replay up with the slides after. If you have further questions that we don't have that you're not able to answer live, and Rachelle will be in the Facebook group. And then if you want to connect with other participants, please use the chat box and make sure it's selected so that everyone can see your messages. And with all of that taken care of, we can begin. So hello, everybody. My name is Haley from ProWritingAid, and today we are joined by Anne Hawley and Rachelle Ramirez of Pages and Platforms. I'm so excited to have them here. For those of you for whom this is your first session with Anne and Rachelle, there's going to be a lot of information coming at you. So please feel free to either just listen or take notes. Again, you'll get the slides after this, and the replays will be up for at least a week or lifetime if you have ProWritingAid Premium. So you will be able to get this again, because there's going to be lots of great information here. Anne has 5 decades of writing experience and has been a developmental editor since 2015. She is the author of the historical love story Restraint. And like Anne, Rachelle was trained by Sean Coyne of StoryGrid and has edited award-winning and best-selling fiction and nonfiction. And she has an MA in psychology from Goddard College and is the author of An Introduction to Genre. So, Anne and Rachelle, if you're ready, I'm going to just disappear and learn alongside everyone else. All right, have fun.
Well, thank you, Haley. Yeah, I think I'm ready. It is the crack of dawn here on the West Coast of the United States. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and we'll get started. She says, hopefully. There we go. All right. Okay, everybody seeing a black screen, I hope? There we go. Welcome to the Crime Story Masterclass from Pages and Platforms and the Happily Ever Author Club. You can find out more about us and download our free guide to the 7 story types at storypath.me, and we'll give that link again at the end. As Haley has said, I'm Ann Hawley, and here with me is my fellow developmental editor, Rachelle Ramirez. Let's get started in this crime story masterclass. Why in the world are we here today? Well, maybe because you've got a crime story in progress, or are thinking of writing one, or you've got a finished manuscript that needs some work. Maybe you've come to this webinar because you're grappling with how to structure your story, or you have some scattershot scenes of crime and detection that aren't quite working together yet, or haven't entertained your beta readers or your writing group, or you're not 100% clear on exactly what constitutes a crime story, or maybe you hope to incorporate some crime-like elements in a primarily character-driven story type, and you're not sure how to proceed. Well, you are in the right place. As Haley has said a couple of times, it can't be stressed enough. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We'll begin with a little discussion of what crime stories are even for and why people like them. We'll go into some of the most popular subtypes or subgenres of crime, and we'll cover the essential elements that good stories of any type require. And after that, Rachelle will reveal how those essential elements play out in a satisfying crime story using examples from a popular movie, and how those elements fall into a working, solid 4-act story. Before we start, we would like to deliver one important caveat. Everything that we teach at Pages and Platforms and the Happily Ever Author Club are tools, not rules. So we encourage you as a creative person and an author to take what you need here and leave the rest. Put the tools to the test and set them aside if or when they stop serving you. Now, let's start by examining what crime stories are even for. Why do we like them, and why do we keep on telling them? To start with, human beings are just storytellers. We love stories, they're entertaining, they pass the time, but of course, they are more than that. We, as writers, feel drawn to tell certain kinds of stories, and our audience or readers feel drawn to read them for certain subconscious reasons. Across cultures and through time, we have created and shared stories to preserve essential information about how to survive and thrive as human beings. Each story type has a unique purpose in human culture. Not all stories are told the same way or with the same purpose across time and around the world. But why in particular today do we tell stories about crime? Well, one of the basic human needs after the bare minimum survival requirements like food and water is the need to feel safe, to be secure in our bodies, our homes, our possessions, and this is at least part of what crime stories are for. Crime stories remind us that vigilance is the price of that security. They warn real wrongdoers that crime doesn't pay in a just society, but crime stories also show us that society can be unjust, and every society has been unjust to some of its people some of the time. Crime stories demonstrate the power of diligence and cleverness by giving us protagonists who outwit the criminal or wrongdoer using brains over brawn. The thing is, crime is universal. Wherever there are humans, there's crime. People will harm each other, take each other's stuff, trick and defraud people, and generally break the codes that would otherwise allow them to live together in community. The first written code of laws, the Code of Hammurabi, this is it here, dating to about 1900 BCE. And advances in learning and technology over the last 4,000 years have not eradicated crime, chaos, or injustice. In fact, they just offer new avenues for people to do wrong. Because again, where there are humans, there's crime and wrongdoing. And we like stories about it. Stories about crime help us establish cultural norms about what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust. They track changing relationships between the community and the justice system. For example, in the original Sherlock Holmes stories, they center on the extreme competence of one genius and the relative incompetence of official policing in Victorian England. Whereas the beginning of the 21st century in the United States found us absorbing lots of crime stories about the competence, the high technology, scientific skills, teamwork of publicly funded law enforcement agencies, as in crime scene investigation. People love to read and watch crime stories because it's a chance to feel the sense of security that comes from seeing the wrongdoer get their comeuppance. Crime stories satisfy the need for order and security by showing us competent crime fighters. This is the police taking the famous serial killer Ted Bundy away. And crime stories help us maintain the pleasant fiction that our official justice systems will always stand up for right against wrongdoers. But there's another important value in crime stories, and that's to vent feelings of outrage and injustice when systems of law fail us, and express solidarity with those who have been harmed by structures of power that don't seem answerable to the rule of law. And finally, crime stories hold out, well, this isn't finally because there's one more after this, they hold out the promise that cleverness and diligence can solve the tricky puzzle that brute force cannot solve. And they provide us the feeling of intrigue and satisfaction we get from solving a puzzle with or just ahead of the clever investigator in the story. So let's look at what crime stories have in common. There are a bunch of popular subtypes or subgenres of crime. And before we examine them, we need to see what they all have in common. First of all, they use all the tools of good storytelling, and I will define those in a moment. Crime stories are plot-driven. This means that the protagonist is primarily motivated by external, real-world events and characters, the crime, the criminal, and so forth. And the protagonist takes action in the external world to go after what they want. In pretty much all crime stories, the protagonist either wants to restore justice or order, or discover the truth and solve the puzzle, usually despite difficult odds. The definition of justice and injustice is contextual, and it will depend on your subtype or subgenre, but either the crime will be an actual, on the books, act of wrongdoing that can be redressed through official channels of the justice system, or it will be an unfair act that's not technically illegal or that can't be entrusted to law enforcement, and then it calls for poetic justice, sometimes in the form of another crime. Or in some cases where crime is the supporting story type in a character-driven story, there's an unsolved mystery that is simply personal to the protagonist. So those are the commonalities. How do the crime subgenres differ? Well, they vary by the protagonist's profession. This may be a law enforcement officer, a sleuth, a private investigator, a lawyer, a journalist, sometimes even a criminal, sometimes just an ordinary person. They vary by the type of crime and the type of criminal, for example, murder, serial murder, or white-collar crime. And they vary by setting. The story may take place in today's real world, whether urban, small town, or rural, or they may take place in a fantasy setting or a science fiction future or in the past. And this brings us to the subtypes of crime stories. Now, several crime subtypes have been popular in recent years, and by recent years, I mean the past 100 years. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Writers have been combining and recombining these at least since Edgar Allan Poe first published The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. And the genre continues to change, but here we go. In the classic murder mystery, the investigator is often a private citizen, a person of means sometimes who has a special knack for investigation, or they may be a law enforcement official, but working alone or with just a single sidekick. The story is focused more on the step-by-step accumulation of clues and red herrings and on the investigator's careful thought processes in solving the puzzle than it is on the trial, the conviction, or the sentencing of the culprit. While a murder mystery can take place in any setting, it's classically confined to a crucible-like environment, such as a small town, an isolated country house, a train, Murder on the Orient Express, or an island. The cozy mystery is a variation on the murder mystery, which minimizes blood, gore, and violence. The protagonist's goal in the murder mystery, and probably the reader's goal, is to figure out what happened and restore order in the community where the murder has taken place. A couple of examples from relatively recent crime fiction include The Coroner's Lunch by Colin Cotterill, featuring a reluctant coroner in communist Laos of the 1970s. trying to solve the murder of a senior official's wife. It's a lot of fun. And Sleep Well, My Lady by Kwei Kwarte, where a cop in Accra, the capital of Ghana, washes out of the police force and decides to get back on her feet by investigating a year-old unsolved celebrity murder on her own. Next, we have the courtroom drama. Here, the protagonist is a lawyer, often a public prosecutor, or maybe an intern at a law firm or a law firm investigator. The courtroom story is focused on criminal conviction, the freeing of the innocent, or civil proceedings by injured parties against corporate bad actors. The protagonist may alternatively be defending the wrongly accused and trying to discover the real wrongdoer. The criminal may be a corporate entity, organized crime, or a corrupt individual, something or someone usually with political power or wealth. And the goal is social justice, usually involving a large social problem such as racism, economic inequality, environmental destruction, or domestic abuse. Courtroom drama is especially effective in filmed stories. Here are a couple of examples. Section 375 is a drama from India that pits a passionate young prosecutor against an apathetic defender in a #MeToo-like case involving allegations of rape. In the 2013 Chinese film Silent Witness, a high-powered lawyer defends an accused murderer, but the whole case starts to unravel as both defense and prosecution together uncover an unexpected truth. Next, we have the journalism or newsroom drama. In this type of crime story, the protagonist is a journalist who is working to uncover a crime that official law enforcement has ignored or failed to act on or doesn't know about yet. So the crime involved is usually some form of corruption or a large social issue that creates injustice for the many, such as corporate malfeasance. The goal of the journalist is generally twofold: to expose crime and rise in status, get the big scoop, win the Pulitzer or whatever. The crime in this type of story is often scandalous, such as corruption or sex offenses. The criminal is often a powerful leader, a corporation or a government entity hiding ruinous scandal or corruption behind their power and wealth. One example of a journalism crime story is The Fragility of Bodies by Argentinian author Sergio Olguin, where a tough, well-connected reporter digs into a report of suicide on the railroad tracks, only to uncover a horrific, deadly game. Another is Stieg Larsson's giant bestseller, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, where a disgraced former journalist working as a ghostwriter decides to investigate the long ago disappearance of his client's granddaughter and joins forces with a young hacker to uncover astonishing corruption. Next, we have the police procedural. This has been a dominant crime story type in at least American television since the dawn of television. Police procedurals feature a protagonist who is a law enforcement official, local police, sheriff, federal agent, Scotland Yard, Texas Ranger, etc. And it is focused on using accepted legal procedure and forensic science to identify and capture a criminal. Their goal is to get the violent felon off the street and restore the social order. The protagonist usually operates as part of a modern policing team, at a minimum a pair of cop partners who are officials of a state-run law enforcement agency. The crime type is usually a violent felony. Here's an example I recently enjoyed, a police procedural in a historical setting, Detective L. This features a Sherlock Holmes-style investigator in 1930s Shanghai, working with a policewoman and a coroner to solve a series of criminal cases that point to a large conspiracy. And the costumes in this are fabulous. Another enjoyable police procedural, this one in a fantasy setting, is the Rivers of London series of novels by Ben Aronovich. Here, the protagonist is a young police officer learning magic in a generally realistic modern-day London, where his special secret police unit handles crimes committed by characters from myth and legend. Now, a big crowd pleaser, the crime subtype of caper and heist. Our example story, which Rachelle is going to take us through in detail in a few minutes, comes from this subgenre. This is the story where crime does pay and two wrongs do make a right. In the caper or heist story, the protagonist is already a criminal, or becomes one at the start of the story. They are seeking retribution or justice outside the law, that is, redressing a wrong done to them personally that may or may not have been an actual crime. The protagonist always forms a team with special skills that operates on private funding sources or with the promise of a big payoff. They often commit white-collar crime involving theft, fraud, and deception. Now, the heist subtype may involve more violence and a darker tone, while the caper subtype is by definition lighter and generally nonviolent, focused on skill and teamwork. A caper novel set in a fantasy environment is Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn, The Final Empire. Here, a thieving crew recruits a young woman with special magical powers to join the team in a plan to overthrow the empire by stealing its treasury and collapsing its economy. The Heist Society series is a series of YA novels that begin with a young woman who's born into the criminal world of art theft and con games, and who has to organize a team of teenagers to steal back some stolen paintings. Next, we have the ever-popular crime thriller. In the crime thriller, the protagonist may be a law enforcement officer, a lawyer, or even, in some cases, just a private citizen. They're tracking a criminal who has monstrous characteristics, for example, a serial killer or a pedophile. The criminal is also often a mastermind, at least as clever as the protagonist, and they eventually target the protagonist directly. The crimes are usually multiple violent felonies, and the protagonist's goal is to stop the criminal before they strike again. One example is The Alienist by Caleb Carr. This is is a historical psychological thriller in which an alienist or psychologist and a group of specialists track down a serial killer in 1890s New York City. And another is Red Ink by Angela McColwa. This is also a psychological thriller, and it's set in modern-day Johannesburg. Here, a convicted serial killer asks an ambitious young journalist to write his story, but a series of violent events in the city begin to make her suspect that somehow, even though he's in prison, he's behind the attacks. Note that this might also technically be considered a journalist crime story. Finally, a word about stories with crime-like elements supporting a more character-driven or internal story. In this type of supporting story, the protagonist is needing to uncover a hidden truth. So certain investigative skills and situations do come into play. The antagonist is not usually an actual criminal, and the hidden truth may have nothing to do with an actual crime, but is more of a puzzle. And solving the puzzle restores order to the protagonist's own mind and life, rather than restoring the broader social order. This kind of story is usually less involved with the basic needs of security and property, and points more toward the protagonist's individual self-actualization or personal growth. Still, many of the essential elements of a crime story are present in this type of story. The adoption memoir often has these investigative elements, as in All You Can Ever Know by Nicole Chung. This details the author's own search for the truth about her adoption and her biological parents. An example from fiction is John Green's Turtles All the Way Down, which is primarily a young adult worldview story or coming-of-age story in which the protagonist is pursuing the truth about a crime secondarily to her process of coming to terms with her mental illness. Now, these subtypes are important. They might make or break a potential reader's decision to read your book or not. Some readers cannot get enough cozy mysteries. Others won't go for anything but a thriller. Each crime subtype has its own rules, and you do need to know them. If you're writing in a fantasy setting, for example, you'd better be aware of the current trends in both crime and fantasy. You need to be reading in that area to know what readers today expect and want. But regardless of the subtype or the setting or the marketing category, they all have certain structural elements in common. And these elements are common to all good storytelling of any story type. There are 6 of them. First, a good working story of any type has a protagonist who is incited by some event to pursue a singular desire. That desire establishes the stakes, what the protagonist has to gain and what they have to lose. In pursuit of that desire or goal, and in facing those stakes, they undergo a change from the beginning of the story to the end. And a good working story has a clear premise that's reflected in every scene. And it is driving towards the emotion the audience expects to feel. And finally, it has the specific character types in specific moments that are called for in your story type. Crime, of course, is the story type that we are talking about today. So, desire, stakes, change, premise, emotion, and characters and moments, these are the essential elements, the puzzle pieces or building blocks that a story of any type needs in order to work. And you will be hearing much more about them from Rachelle in just a few minutes. When all of these are clear in your story will be on the right track. And as a writer looking to turn out a good working crime story of any of the subgenres, one that satisfies its intended reader, you have a puzzle of your own to solve. You need to know how the essential story elements we just went through play out in a crime story. And you have to combine those elements skillfully into a crime story that works. And that is what my good friend and colleague, Rachelle Ramirez, is going to cover for the rest of the webinar. Rachelle, take it away.
Thanks, Anne. To illustrate the elements of crime, we've chosen Widows, a 2018 American heist film from a screenplay by Gillian Flynn and Steve McQueen. The story is about a woman who assembles a team of recently widowed women to steal $5 million from a corrupt politician in order to repay another politician for her deceased husband's debt. I know, that's a lot. We chose this film as a masterwork because of the diverse representation of traditionally marginalized characters and because the screenplay received critical acclaim. Using widows for examples, let's look at the components you'll need for your crime story. The first element your story needs is a strong desire, which is basically what your protagonist wants and what they need. Desire, like all the story elements we're going to cover, changes based on your story type. A crime story is primarily focused on your protagonist's want, which is essentially to restore justice and order. This may be approached by solving a crime or pulling off a crime. The need of the crime protagonist can be just about anything in the beginning of the story, whether to gain knowledge, that would be a worldview supporting story, rise in status, a validation supporting story, or atone for past wrongs, a redemption supporting story. The need motivates the protagonist toward action. In Widows, the protagonist, Veronica, here on the left, wants to end the chaos her husband's crime created and restore justice via a heist. She needs to gain knowledge and connect to another person, specifically Alice. The second element your crime story needs is stakes, which is what the protagonist has to gain or lose. What does the crime protagonist have to lose? It's social order and the belief that justice will prevail. What do they have to gain? It's the restoration of justice and social order. Also, the satisfaction of solving or pulling off the crime. The stakes of a crime story run along a continuum from justice, unfairness, injustice, and false justice, and from chaos, order, and false order. In a crime story, every scene should move the protagonist closer to justice and order or closer to injustice and chaos. In Widows, Veronica plummets quickly to chaos and danger. So what she stands to lose throughout the story is her belief that justice is possible. What she has to gain is the restoration of justice and order. The third element your story needs is a character change of state. And we're going to switch slides here. This is the change your protagonist makes as a result of the pressures they face in the story. It's how they are different in the beginning of the story from how they are in the end. The change for your character in a crime story might seem obvious, from injustice to justice or chaos to order. But what we're talking about here is the internal change. And that is determined by your supporting story type. Now, I mentioned worldview, validation, and redemption story types earlier. You can learn more about the other story types with the link we'll give you at the end of this webinar. We won't leave you hanging. So what's the character change of state in Widows? The protagonist begins the story in ignorance and disconnection from everyone except her husband. She ends in wisdom, connection with Alice, and disconnection from her husband. The fifth element your story needs is a premise.
Oh, it looks like Anne and Rachelle just had some issues. Can you guys hear me? Oh, I think there's Rachelle again. Hey, Rachelle.
Hello.
Did you get kicked out? All right.
I guess so.
No problem. Let me, do you want to send Anne a message and I could share? Oh, there
Here
she goes.
is. Oh, here she
Hello.
is.
Sorry, we disappeared. Now
Sorry,
we're back.
everybody.
We're
I
back.
don't know what happened. Let's get back to sharing this thing. Just a moment.
And
No
what
worries.
slide do we think we were on?
You were on a
on-
slide of Viola Davis.
Okay.
Yeah, Viola Davis, big Viola Davis face.
Yeah, exactly. Here we go.
Okay,
That's 142.
I think so. Just a second here. Okay. There, big Viola Davis face.
I'm on 142,
There you go.
right? Or no?
I think we can just start. If we recap some stuff, I think it'll be fine too, either way.
Okay. And I'm going to start on 142, which is
Oh.
in Widows, Veronica plummets.
No, we were way past that.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go down to 148 where you were premise.
There
Okay.
you go. Yeah, sorry, flipping around here.
Sorry, everybody. All right. So the fifth element your story needs is a premise. The premise is the central idea your story has in a single cause and effect statement that comes directly from your protagonist's choices based on what they want, what they need, and what's at stake. Some general premise ideas for crime stories are, and these are just examples, clever investigators restore order by outwitting the criminal. Good police work results in justice. The rule of law moves society toward justice. Crime pays when people team up to cheat the system, but not each other. The premise statement of Widows might be, a clever heist restores justice and order by cheating other criminals.
Sorry.
The fourth element your crime story needs is emotion. The emotion is what the reader wants to feel, the reason they choose your type of story. Crime readers want to feel the security of seeing justice done and safety restored, or the intrigue of solving a puzzle and feeling more intelligent than the protagonist. That's why I love them. The audience for Widows probably wants to feel suspense throughout and ultimately the satisfaction of seeing women get justice against extreme odds. The sixth essential element every good story needs are certain kinds of characters and moments. We'll start with the specific characters. Crime audiences expect you to deliver the kinds of characters that make a crime story a crime story. These are roles or archetypes rather than specific individual characters. That is, a single role may be played by more than one character, and a single character may play more than one role. First, your crime story needs a protagonist, the primary character of the story who faces stakes of justice and injustice. They must be actively trying to solve a puzzle and restore order. Give them characteristics the audience can identify with, like deductive brilliance, sophistication, flaws. Make them less powerful than the antagonist, primarily due to lack of knowledge or resources. In caper and heist stories, the protagonist is committing the crime and seeking a form of justice that the law might not recognize. In Widows, while there is an ensemble cast, Veronica is the primary protagonist with bravery, determination, integrity, and intelligence. Of course, you need an antagonist. The antagonist in a crime story is the primary external force of opposition for the protagonist, generally the criminal. The antagonist is a step ahead of the protagonist at the start of the story and has information that the protagonist wants. Their motives must be complex and believable, even if abhorrent. When the antagonist is an antagonistic force, like a criminal gang, a corporation, or an organized crime ring, it becomes a situation rather than a character, but it serves some of the same story purposes. Even so, that force must speak through characters such as a politician, a hench, or a CEO. In Widows, the women who participate in the heist are the antagonist to the victim they steal money from, but the pinnacle of antagonism in the story is Veronica's husband, Harry, who has forced them into the dangerous situation that makes the heist seem necessary. In Widows, Harry is the ultimate antagonist, but he's also involved in a crime ring in which he steals from one politician to pay off another politician. And this pits multiple forces against the protagonist, Veronica, raising the stakes throughout the story. Other antagonist forces at play are racism and misogyny, embodied by most of the antagonistic characters. A crime story requires at least one victim. This is a character, a group, or sometimes the environment that has suffered injustice at the hands of the antagonist. The victim requires either rescue from the criminal or, if already deceased, justice. The human victim is often powerless and dependent for justice on a law-enforcing protagonist. In a heist or caper, the victim is, oddly enough, the antagonist. However, the victim in a murder mystery and many police procedurals is often the dead person discovered in chapter 1. Finally, we need to look at essential moments. These are the change points that support your story. You'll want to build your story around these essential moments to create the conflict that will drive your plot forward. In the setup of a crime story, an investigator or mastermind, that is, the protagonist, is engaged in their everyday activities, either solving or doing crime. And once the crime is incited or discovered, those activities will prove relevant to the protagonist's search for justice. In the beginning of Widows, 4 women are shown in their ordinary worlds, enabling their husbands' crime careers. In the inciting incident, someone or something alerts the protagonist to a crime or crime opportunity, changing their state from business as usual to inspired to restore justice. In Widows, Veronica learns of the inciting crime from Jamal, that her husband, the master criminal, stole $2 million from Jamal, and she has just weeks to pay him back and restore justice. The character, Bash, unknowingly offers the solution with the key to the notebook. The third essential moment is the Act 1 peak. This is usually when the investigator sees objections to investigating the crime, or the mastermind may see flaws in the proposed crime. A mentor may offer critical advice, whether good or bad, depends on the nature of the mentor. In Widows, Veronica realizes the plans in her husband's notebook require 3 more team members, a prescription for high risk and critical missing information, including the location of the intended heist. Our fourth essential moment is really a series of moments or scenes that raise the stakes throughout Act 2 and increase the complications. Here, the investigator starts finding clues, some of which are false or misleading, also known as red herrings. Characters affected by the crime may help or hinder the investigation. In a caper or heist, the team forms but runs into difficulties with the original plan. One of them may demonstrate they are a shapeshifter or incompetent. In Widows, Veronica invites the other widows of the original heist to join her team. One doesn't show up, and it turns out she's the shapeshifter. The fifth essential moment in the crime story is the midpoint shift. As the name implies, this happens at approximately the middle of the story and moves a crime story from Act 2 into Act 3. The protagonist realizes they must change their approach to solving the case or pulling off the crime. Having just discovered her husband faked his own death and that she has the opportunity to sell the notebook, Veronica enters her deceased son's room and decides, in subtext at this point, to proceed with the heist, preventing her husband from obtaining the money, to use the money to honor her son in memoriam, and to gain closure, restore justice, and end the chaos. The sixth essential is the global peak. This is where the investigator confronts the criminal directly, gambling on the correctness of their deductions, or the mastermind faces the antagonist alone to protect the team, gambling that most of them will escape with the loot. Widows has a crisis moment in the heist sequence in which Veronica must decide whether to complete the heist at any cost and kill another woman, who is also a victim of racism and misogyny, or risk the success of the heist. She chooses not to kill her. A common element found specifically in the heist or caper is when one team member is harmed and the stakes increase. In Widows, Alex is shot, prompting the unexpected murder of one of their antagonistic victims. In the resolution, the investigator brings the criminal to justice, restoring the legal social order, or the mastermind and the team get away with the loot for poetic justice. The resolution usually includes one or two moments showing that is proving that order and balance have been restored. As Veronica is unloading the money the team stole into the secret hideout, her husband returns to demand the money for himself. She kills him, defending her own life and bringing the ultimate antagonist to justice. In Widows, all of the women of the heist live and are successful in restoring some justice against misogyny, racism, deception, and political corruption, though it comes at a particularly high cost for Veronica and Alice. And now the big question: how do you put all of these elements together to write your crime story? Well, let's look at the structure of the beginning hook, middle build, and ending payoff, the 4-act structure. Think of your story as a big circus tent. There's a lot of story material, and you need tent poles to support the weight of it all. We think of the main tent poles as delineating a 4-act structure. And don't get too hung up on the number 4. Screenwriters usually think in 3 acts. Playwrights might structure their works in 5 acts. We use the 4-act structure at Pages and Platforms because we've found it to be the most helpful and efficient way to help authors think about their stories and get them lined up. So in an ideal or perfect story, each act is supposedly 25%. But in modern storytelling, and particularly with the crime story, the act structure looks a little more like this. A short, quick Act 1, as little as 10% of the story, which introduces the protagonist, their ordinary life, their main gift and flaw, and the puzzle they need to solve. Fully 80% of the story is devoted to rising complications leading to the global crisis and climax. And the resolution is a relatively short series of moments that wind the story up in the final 10% or so. We saw this pattern in Widows, where the final wrap-up is even shorter than that. There are key events in each act. The beginning hook is also called Act 1, and you've got a lot to pack in here without overwhelming the audience. The first thing you need to do is introduce the protagonist in their ordinary world, doing something that's normal for them. Demonstrate their fear or flaw, something they will overcome or fail to overcome later. Demonstrate the injustice, the inciting crime or opportunity to commit a crime that interrupts their ordinary world. Introduce interesting supporting characters that serve your story arc. Demonstrate what the protagonist wants, justice and order, and their needs based on their internal change. Make the stakes clear. Stakes in crime are not for subtext. What can the protagonist gain? What can they lose? In transitioning from Act 1 to Act 2, your location will often change, but it is not required. Put clues, red herrings, which are false clues, and obstacles between the protagonist and their goal. Make sure the obstacles escalate, the pressure increases for your protagonist, and create a midpoint shift where the protagonist goes from reactive to proactive and changes their tactics. The midpoint shift transitions the story to Act 3. So in the middle build part 2, you'll want to continue escalating the complications and raising the stakes, and remove the protagonist's hope of restoring justice in an all is lost moment at the end of the middle build. In your ending payoff, or Act 4, you're answering the questions you set up previously. Write a climax in which the protagonist confronts the antagonist. Show the protagonist rising to the challenge and confronting their fear or flaw. Demonstrate how the protagonist outwits the antagonist for a prescriptive tale, or show the antagonist outwitting the protagonist for a cautionary tale. Now, you'll also want to create a resolution showing justice restored or continued injustice or chaos. And that's the basic story structure for a crime story. Okay, we know this has been a lot to absorb. So let's do a really quick review before we jump into the Q&A. And don't worry, there will be a replay. Today, you've learned what a crime story is for, some popular crime subtypes, the essential story requirements you can use for your crime story, and how to build those elements into a 4-act structure of your story. And now you have the basics of the crime story, a structural framework for writing and editing your story, and a plan to finish your professional working draft. So congratulations, now you have a path to a solid crime story. Before we go into the Q&A, we'd like to remind you to visit www.storypath.me to get our guide to the 7 essential story types, because crime is just one of them. That's www.storypath.me. And if you haven't already, please type your questions into the Q&A box, and let's go to it.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. And just to answer a couple housekeeping ones first, all of the replays and recordings are all on the Crime Week Hub, which is that last link on the links that I've been dropping in the chat. So if you want to come back to this, you want to check out the slides after we upload everything, ProWritingAid.com/Crime Week Hub. Go check that out. All right, so we've got a lot of questions. And again, as I mentioned, Rachelle will be in the Facebook group after to answer any questions that are still outstanding. So first, someone has a question that's very close to my heart, which is, can there be fantasy as a subgenre in a crime story, or can there be certain fantasy elements in a crime story? And the person who asked this said that this might be kind of unusual, and I just want to say that's not unusual at all.
No,
it's very, very common. Yeah.
I think we had 2 or 3 examples of fantasy crime stories in our examples. Absolutely, they work very well together. Urban fantasy is often a crime story. Yeah, it's a great combination.
Yeah.
And we think of fantasy as the setting for your crime story. So your crime is how you structure the story, what your story is about. It's set in a fantastical world or under fantastical circumstances.
Yeah. And that could, of course, inform how they're pulling off a heist, what the justice systems are, all of that type of stuff can happen within the purview of a different world. Okay, please remember if you have questions to put them into the Q&A because the chat, they will get lost. So Chris asks, are the want and need part of the motivation goal of the story for the protagonist?
Hi, Chris. Yes, short answer, yes, absolutely. The inciting incident is the crime, generally speaking, and that finding out about the crime is what makes the protagonist want justice, to get justice or restore the order to the society. And their need, the internal driver for that might be, Rachelle mentioned, there are three main internal drivers to that. Either they need to learn something, they're after information, that's a worldview, or they need to get an award or win the journalist who wants the Pulitzer type of thing, that's a validation. Or they need to atone for their own past wrongs, that would be a redemption internal need. So yes, the want and need drive the story forward.
All right, so Chuck asks, do the characteristics that we've talked about also apply to mystery or crime short stories?
Yes, the 4-act structure does not necessarily apply to a short story. It might be a 1-act, sort of everything fits into 1 act, but yes, all those essential elements need to appear probably in a very brief form in a short story.
But maybe not all the essential character. I mean, it depends. How short is your short story? Is it really more of a scene rather than a full story with a beginning, middle, and an end? You can get away with shaving some of this off here and there, but it really depends. There are so many different story structures you can use for a short story that these will probably be there in one way or another, but not as clear cut as they look like here in this presentation.
And at a minimum, your protagonist needs to be going for justice, basically, looking to restore order, restore justice, restore the balance. That's the fundamental of a crime story.
Great. MJ says, I've written a police procedural in a historic setting. It is based on real events and people. In life, the story did not have a happy ending. Do I tweak it for the purposes of fiction? Should I let it stand? As it is, I've settled for the police detective deciding, despite his grave losses, to leave law enforcement, but with resignation, not with joy.
I think.
Oh, go ahead, Rachelle.
Anne did this great presentation about historical stories, and it was really interesting to see how she linked the whole idea of historical stories with fantasy. They're very, very similar. You are making up dialogue. You are making up pieces of the story. You weren't there. We don't live in that time period. It's the past. It is a bit fantastical. So do you have to go with exactly the way things happened in history? Only if you're saying this is a true story. If you say this is based on a true story, or better yet, inspired by a true story, then you don't have to. But if you're saying this is a true story and this is the way it happened, you're going to be accused of lying, deceiving your readers, and you probably don't want to go down that hole.
So Janet asks, can you explain the difference between thriller and crime?
Thriller is a subtype of crime. Well, there are different kinds of thrillers too, but a crime thriller, as we sort of went through, is different from other crime stories, mostly in that the criminal is a monster of some sort. There's a sort of monstrous element, and they end up usually going after or personally targeting the investigator. There are other kinds of thrillers. There are also spy thrillers and things that are kind of a little bit different, but we think of thrillers basically a subtype of the overarching crime story, right, with those additional elements.
The thriller will have aspects of action. There may be life and death for the protagonists themselves. The protagonist is part of the criminal's plan or escape plan, at least. And there are aspects of horror, whether it be psychological horror or gore, one way or another. Yeah. There are aspects of horror.
Yeah, the monstrous elements of the criminal.
And monstrous meaning they can't be reasoned with. There's no rationalizing this situation with him. Texas Chainsaw Massacre horror, but you're not going to have an argument. You're not going to convince the Texas Chainsaw guy of, you're not going to talk him out of his plan, right? Now that's horror, but you get the idea. Somebody who can't be reasoned with. It can be a person.
Put down the chainsaw. Bailey asks if you're
It's just the wrong idea.
Yeah, exactly. Bailey asks, if you're writing a crime series, how much should you resolve in each book's ending to get readers to read the next book but still feel satisfied?
Well, you can play this different ways. I think most readers expect the crime to be solved in each story and the character to recur for another crime in the next story. If you're writing a crime that needs to be carried out over 3 novels, 3 volumes or something, I would probably, I think the readers are looking to solve each crime and for the protagonist investigator to develop as a protagonist, as a person, and as a investigator over the course of a series.
Right. So one option might be they solve a crime in this story, done, and then they realize, but that crime was part of this bigger crime that's causing all these crimes over here, this crime ring or something. So book 2, they go to this crime ring and they solve that and they pull down the crime ring. And then in book 3, they discover, oh crap, that crime ring was part of the whole political system of our world. Right. Now they got to go and attack this whole political system to solve this crime, so
Sherlock
there
Holmes
are ways to
has
move it up.
Moriarty for a long series of stories. He's kind of in the background, and Sherlock solves totally solves each crime, but we're always aware that he's going to have to face Moriarty at some point. That's the
big bad.
Yeah, the big bad, right?
Yeah. Teresa asks, at what point in the story does the protagonist discover a body?
Early. Early. That's generally in a murder mystery. I assume you're talking about a murder mystery. That's the inciting incident, and it has to happen within the first 10% of your story.
Or earlier. Yeah. I mean, I would even say earlier.
Often it's like the first thing on the first page.
Yeah. First chapter.
Yeah. And then there might be more bodies throughout, but yes, that
right.
kind of kicks it off.
There can be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Christine asks, can you have a team of protagonists in a crime story? I think heists are a great example of that.
Heist police procedural is also usually a team. Yeah.
But there's always one main protagonist, one main person. Ocean's 11, for example, one main person that's the head of the team. If you have a police procedural and you have a team of police, you have one primary person. Even in a buddy cop story,
one's primary. Yeah.
One is primary, the other is secondary, and challenging the arc of the other. So there's always one at the top.
Yes.
A good follow-up question on the dead body on page 1. So someone asks, how can authors find a good balance between showing the characters in their normal setting, so kind of establishing that ordinary world, but there's also this like shocking discovery of the dead body on page 1 or right away? How does that balance work?
You would try and show them doing what they would ordinarily do as quickly as possible. So if I am going to find a body, you're going to have to put it in, and I'm your protagonist, you're going to have to put it in my ordinary world. I'm a mom. I'm not going much farther than the grocery store or within these Zoom calls and writers and the Zoom. So you're going to have to put that, I'm going to be doing those things, go into the grocery store or on these Zoom calls with writers or whoever your protagonist is doing
pushing your grocery cart along and you
right?
bump over a dead body at the grocery store.
Sometimes I want to.
It doesn't take a lot to establish the character's ordinary environment. It doesn't. You do not need a whole backstory. You do not need a whole chapter of history. Little indications and actions showing what they ordinarily do and what they ordinarily have like wrong in their mind that they need to sort out in the course of the story.
Okay, I know we're running out of time. So a number of people have asked about romance as a subplot or crime as a subplot for romance or romance as a subplot for crime. How do those two work together?
Great. The characters usually are either involved in solving a crime together or they come together as a result of working on the same crime. Sometimes there's a sort of the investigator falls in love with the criminal. It works. There's a number of ways you can approach that, but yeah, so it's a popular combination. And I think that's the most important thing for the writer is to decide which one is going to be primary. Right. Is it a love story or is it a crime story primarily? And then which one is the subplot?
So which one is pushing against the primary story to support it and give complications to the primary story? It is really important to know which one's on top.
Yeah, and I think if you're understanding which one's on top, that will also inform your ending, right? Like if you're writing a romance with a crime subplot, then the couple's going to be together at the end. There will be that happily ever after, where if it's opposite, it might be different, right? If it's a crime story with a romantic subplot, there could be some more tragedy layered in there because again, the readers are expecting something different. Okay, so let's do one final question. And then for everybody who's asking, there will be a transcript of the chat. Again, find Rachelle in the Facebook group. I'm going to put the link to the hub here one more time. The hub has a link to the Facebook group where you can come and ask Rachelle questions. She has not gone to sleep yet tonight, so she might be back in a little bit. She might take a nap and then come back. But we'll do one final question. Oh, I just had it and I lost it. So someone asked, how do you create smart clues or conclusions, especially if your character is smarter than you yourself as the writer are? We do have a red herrings workshop later this week, so come to that. But I think
that might be the way. That might be the way to go on that. I always give this advice to my clients, and I don't do a lot of crime fiction in my editing practice, but look at what other writers are doing. Read masterworks. We gave you, I think, 21 examples or something in today's class. Look at what's more important, the red herrings and the clues and the investigator's intelligence, or is it their internal change and how they grow as a result of facing the crime, that sort of thing. There's 1,000 ways to do it, and the best way to learn is to don't look at what Agatha Christie did. That was 100 years ago. Look at more recent. You can look at Agatha Christie, but look at more recent crime stories.
And I just want to say, your protagonist probably can't be smarter than you are. They can have more knowledge. They can have more information, they can have more expertise in one area, but they probably can't be smarter than you. You're creating the story. They've got nothing unless you're making it.
Yeah.
Right. If you just are pretending to write some Mensa character and you're not a Mensa character yourself, I would suggest backing down away from that a little bit.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to remember that the antagonist doesn't need to outsmart you; they need to outsmart the protagonist. So keep that in mind as well. And I always think when thinking about think about what will trigger your protagonist, right? What the antagonist, we need to tie back to that need, that want of the protagonist as well. And so sometimes it's not about what's the cleverest thing an antagonist can do, but what would drive the protagonist to the craziest, what would make that, what would trigger them the most. And that will feel very satisfying for the readers.
Wants, needs, flaws.
Exactly.
Think about who you're writing about. That's everything.
Yep. So thank you so much, Rachelle and Anne. This was so fantastic. Again, links in the chat. So please download the 7 story types guide to learn more about the crime genre as well as the other story types. Please go to ProWritingAid.com/Crime Week Hub to find more information about our 30% off discount, which helps just enable us to do more of these events, as well as to find the link to the Facebook group so you can go there and ask Rachelle more questions. Finally, once this recording is done processing, I will add this recording as well as the slides and a link to the chat transcript, as well as a link to the Q&A thread on Facebook, all on the Crime Week Hub. So just keep going to that. I'll drop it in a couple more times, but that final link is where all of this information will be. Thank you both so much again. It's always so great to see you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you all soon. We have another session in about an hour. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.